Karen Smith was used to getting exactly what she wanted: first-class flights, VIP treatment, and the ability to demand respect, or at least, that's what she believed. But on this flight from New York to London, everything falls apart. A heated argument with a flight attendant leads to an unexpected confrontation with the pilot, a woman Karen never expected to be in charge. What starts as a minor inconvenience spirals out of control, exposing secrets that Karen never saw coming. She thinks she's a VIP, but the passenger list says otherwise. She believes her husband supports her, but he's been hiding the truth. By the time the plane lands, Karen will have lost more than just her seat in first class. She'll lose the life she thought she had under control. But is this a punishment she deserves, or a chance to finally change? Find out in this shocking story. But before we take off, make sure to subscribe for more must-watch content. Now tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Karen Smith strutted onto the plane like she owned it. Dressed in a designer blazer, oversized sunglasses perched on her head, and a handbag that probably cost more than some people's rent, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who was used to getting her way. She barely glanced at the passengers boarding behind her as she made her way to seat 3A, a luxurious window seat in first class. Settling in, she let out a sigh of satisfaction. Then, with the impatience of royalty, she raised a manicured hand and snapped her fingers. A flight attendant appeared, approaching with a professional smile. She was a black woman, dressed immaculately in her uniform, exuding warmth and efficiency. "Good evening, ma'am. How can I assist you?" Karen barely looked at her. "I'll have a glass of red wine." "Now." The flight attendant didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we only serve alcohol after takeoff." Karen's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" The woman's tone remained polite but firm. "It's airline policy, ma'am." Karen scoffed, shifting in her seat. "I didn't ask about policy. I paid for first-class service. So why am I being treated like I'm in economy?" The passenger in 3B, a businessman with silver hair, glanced over his newspaper, already sensing trouble. A few other passengers turned their heads. The flight attendant remained calm. "I assure you, ma'am, all passengers receive the same first-class experience. We'll be happy to serve your drink after takeoff." Karen's face darkened. Unbelievable. Her voice rose a little, enough to draw more attention. This is why standards have dropped. This is exactly why certain people shouldn't be in these positions. The subtle dig wasn't subtle at all, and it hit the cabin like a cold gust of wind. For a moment, the entire first-class section went silent. The businessman in 3B stiffened. A younger woman across the aisle widened her eyes. A murmur of discomfort spread. The flight attendant's jaw tightened. But she didn't break composure. Instead, she simply said, "If there's anything else I can do for you, let me know." Then she turned to walk away. But Karen wasn't done. "Oh, so now you're just walking away? I'm not finished with you." Her voice escalated, cutting through the once relaxed atmosphere of first class. At this point, all eyes were on Karen. The flight attendant paused, and then a new voice entered the conversation. Authoritative, undeniably in control. "Is there a problem here?" Karen turned and froze, because standing at the front of the cabin, watching the whole thing unfold, was a woman in a crisp pilot's uniform. Tall, poised, and black. Karen blinked in disbelief. Who are you?" The woman stepped forward. "I'm Captain Michelle Carter, the pilot of this flight." Karen's stomach dropped, but she had no idea just how much worse things were about to get. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She had expected a flight attendant, a supervisor, maybe, but the pilot? No, this had to be a mistake. Captain Carter stood tall and composed, her uniform pristine, her expression unreadable. The gold stripes on her sleeves marked her authority. She wasn't here to take orders, she gave them. Karen's fingers clenched the armrest. "You're the pilot?" Carter gave a curt nod. "That's correct." Karen's mind raced. How was this possible? A black woman in charge of this flight? She had flown first class dozens of times, and never had she seen something like this. And then it hit her. She turned slowly toward the flight attendant she had just insulted. There was a resemblance, same strong features, same confident posture. Karen's stomach dropped. No. There was no way. Captain Carter folded her arms. I happened to overhear your little outburst. Karen forced a stiff smile, trying to salvage the situation. I was just expressing frustration over the service. That's all. Carter's gaze hardened. I think we both know that's not true. Karen's face flushed. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of an audience. A few first-class passengers had put down their reading material, now fully invested in the unfolding drama. The businessman in 3B cleared his throat and turned away, pretending to be deeply engrossed in his newspaper, but Karen could tell he was listening. Even the flight attendant, the one Karen had insulted, stood her ground, watching with an expression that wasn't quite smug but wasn't apologetic either. Karen refused to back down. I paid for first class, she said, forcing a cold smile. I have certain expectations. Carter raised an eyebrow. And you think that includes belittling my crew? Karen bristled. I simply asked for a drink. No, Carter said smoothly. You demanded a drink. And when my flight attendant followed protocol, you insulted her. Karen's jaw tightened. And, Carter continued, her voice calm but firm, you made a remark that frankly I'd classify as racist. A murmur rippled through first class. Karen's face burned. Now, Carter said, stepping closer, I have a few options here. I could escort you off this plane before we even take off, but I'd prefer to settle this another way. Karen stiffened. Settle what? This is ridiculous. I'm a platinum member. I deserve respect. Carter tilted her head slightly. Platinum, you say? She turned to a nearby flight attendant. Pull up the manifest. The flight attendant tapped on a tablet screen, then frowned. Captain, she said carefully, her name isn't on the first-class manifest. Karen blinked. What? The attendant double-checked the list, then turned back to Carter. She's not a platinum member either. Karen's chest tightened. That's impossible, she snapped. Check again. The attendant did. Mrs. Smith, your ticket is for economy class. A heavy silence fell over first class. Karen froze. This wasn't happening. She turned to Captain Carter, desperate. There must be a mistake. Carter's expression remained neutral. No mistake. You're in the wrong seat. Karen's mind raced. Had her assistant booked the wrong ticket? Had there been some kind of glitch? She couldn't be in economy. That was beneath her. Karen forced a laugh. Look, I'm sure we can figure this out. Just upgrade me. Charge my card, whatever. The flight attendant's lips pressed together. I'm sorry, ma'am, but first class is completely full. Karen felt sick. Carter sighed. I'll give you a choice. You can move to your assigned seat, or I can have security escort you off the plane. Karen's hands gripped the armrests. She couldn't back down. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. Then, from behind her, a new voice spoke. A deep, authoritative male voice. Excuse me, the man said. But that's my seat. Karen turned and her stomach dropped again. The man standing before her was tall, confident and well-dressed. A designer suit, polished shoes, and the kind of commanding presence that made people pay attention. But the most shocking detail? He was black. Karen's mind blanked. No, this couldn't be happening. Carter nodded. Mr. Davis. We've been expecting you. The businessman gave Karen a polite but firm smile. It seems there's been a mix-up. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. Carter turned back to her. Mrs. Smith, I won't ask again. Move to your assigned seat. Karen's hands shook. She had never felt so small in her life. She had one choice, and it wasn't a good one. Her nightmare was just beginning. Karen sat frozen in seat 3A, her mind racing for a way out of this disaster. This wasn't possible. First class wasn't just a seat, it was status, privilege, respect. And now, in front of an entire cabin of high-class passengers, she was being told she didn't belong. She turned toward Captain Carter, grasping at the last shreds of her confidence. This is absurd. My husband booked my ticket. There must be some mistake. Captain Carter didn't blink. Your ticket is for economy, Mrs. Smith. The businessman, Mr. Davis, stood patiently beside Karen's seat, his expression calm but expectant. He was waiting for her to move. Karen felt her face flush red. She darted her eyes around the cabin. Some passengers were pretending not to watch, but she knew they were. A woman near the window stole a quick glance before looking away. A man across the aisle smirked slightly behind his newspaper. Karen's nails dug into the leather armrest. No, she couldn't do this. She squared her shoulders. I demand to speak to someone higher up. Captain Carter sighed, rubbing her temple. Mrs. Smith, I am the highest authority on this flight. Karen's stomach twisted. She turned to Mr. Davis, attempting a forced smile. Surely we can work something out. You wouldn't mind switching seats, would you? Mr. Davis chuckled, shaking his head. I paid for first class. I prefer to keep my seat. Karen's smile cracked. She turned back to Carter, her voice hissing now. You expect me to sit in economy? With those people? The moment the words left her mouth, she knew she had gone too far. The murmurs in first class grew louder. Even the businessman in 3B lowered his newspaper now, his eyes narrowing slightly. Captain Carter's face hardened. Karen's breath caught. She had lost. There was no saving this. Carter gave a curt nod to the flight attendants. Escort her to her assigned seat. Karen's stomach dropped. The young black flight attendant she had insulted earlier stepped forward, gesturing politely toward the aisle. Right this way, ma'am. Karen's fingers gripped the armrest one last time. Then, with no other choice, she stood up. The moment she did, a slow ripple of applause started from the back of the first-class cabin. Karen's head snapped around. Some passengers were clapping. Others simply smirked. A woman near the aisle covered a small laugh with her hand. Karen's entire body burned with humiliation. She snatched her handbag and stormed past Mr. Davis, who sat down in his rightful seat, adjusting his cufflinks with an air of composure. As she passed Captain Carter, she hissed under her breath, "You'll regret this." Carter didn't even glance at her. "Enjoy your flight, Mrs. Smith." Karen bit back a scream and stormed toward the economy cabin, escorted by the flight attendant. The first-class section was separated from economy by a thick navy curtain. When Karen stepped through it, it was like entering a different world. Gone were the spacious leather seats and quiet atmosphere. Economy was cramped, noisy. A baby was wailing somewhere toward the back. A man snored loudly 2 rows ahead. The air smelled like microwaved food and stale coffee. Karen's stomach twisted in horror. This must be a mistake, she muttered. The flight attendant stopped at row 34 and gestured. Here's your seat, ma'am. Karen's eyes widened. 34B, the middle seat, wedged between 2 strangers. To her left, a teenager with oversized headphones, chewing gum loudly, completely unbothered by the world around him. To her right, a large man devouring a greasy burger, licking his fingers with each bite. Karen froze in place. I can't sit here. The flight attendant smiled politely. It's your assigned seat. Karen whispered furiously. There must be another open seat somewhere. The attendant checked her tablet, then looked back up. I'm afraid the flight is completely full. Karen's pulse spiked. She turned back toward first class, as if she could somehow undo what had just happened. But the navy curtain had already closed behind her, sealing her fate. This wasn't happening. She couldn't sit in economy. She wasn't like these people. But the flight attendant was waiting. So were the passengers behind her, already annoyed by the delay. Karen had no choice. With her entire world crashing down, she lowered herself into seat 34B, feeling trapped for the first time in her life. And just when she thought things couldn't get worse, the teenager turned to her, grinning. "Hey lady, you mind if I take my shoes off?" Karen's soul left her body. This was going to be the worst flight of her life. Karen sat stiffly in seat 34B, trapped between a gum-smacking teenager and a man devouring a greasy burger. The air was thick with the scent of onions, cheap cologne, and the faint, musty smell of too many bodies crammed together. She clenched her jaw, refusing to accept that this was happening. This was beneath her. First class was where she belonged, with the warm hand towels, the free champagne, and the service that catered to her every whim. Not here. Not surrounded by crying babies, coughing passengers, and a kid blasting rap music through his headphones. Karen took a deep breath, trying to ignore the sounds, the smells, the sheer discomfort of it all. Then, the teenager next to her stretched his legs and casually kicked off his sneakers, wiggling his toes. Karen gasped in horror. "What do you think you're doing?" The boy grinned. "Relax, lady. It's a long flight." Karen recoiled, pressing herself against the burger-eating man on her right. Unfortunately, that was a mistake, because at that moment, he took a huge bite of his burger, sending a glob of ketchup and grease splattering onto her sleeve. Karen screamed. "Oh, man." "Sorry," the man muttered, barely looking at her as he wiped his mouth with a napkin. Karen gawked at the stain, then at the man. "Are you serious?" The man shrugged. "You shouldn't have leaned into me." Karen's eye twitched. This wasn't just humiliating, it was becoming torture. And just when she thought things couldn't get any worse, a sharp jolt rocked the plane. Passengers gasped. The lights overhead flickered for a brief second. Then a baby wailed, louder than before. Karen gritted her teeth. A voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Karen grabbed the armrests, her pulse spiking. It was just turbulence, right? She wasn't a fan of flying, but first class had always made it tolerable. Now, squeezed between two strangers, with her drink privileges taken away and her coat ruined, it felt infinitely worse. She turned her head slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of Mark, her husband, who was sitting somewhere behind her in economy. That was another unbelievable part of this nightmare. Mark had booked these tickets, and somehow, he had let this happen to her. Karen swallowed her anger. She would deal with Mark later. Right now, she needed to survive this flight from hell. Karen jabbed the call button above her seat. Within seconds, a flight attendant appeared, the same black woman from first class. Karen's face darkened. She straightened her posture, lifting her chin. "I need a new seat." The flight attendant smiled politely. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is full." Karen's nostrils flared. That can't be right. Surely there's a mistake. The woman remained calm. "There's no mistake." Karen forced a tight smile. "What about an upgrade?" The attendant's eyebrow lifted slightly. "To where exactly?" Karen swallowed, trying not to snap. "I don't know. First class." The attendant tilted her head. "First class is full." Karen gritted her teeth. "Then put me in a crew seat. I cannot sit here." The flight attendant's smile didn't budge. "I understand, ma'am," she said smoothly, "but you'll need to remain in your assigned seat." Karen fumed. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" The woman's expression didn't change. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" Karen's fingers curled into fists. She could feel the teenager watching. Even the man with the burger had stopped eating, clearly entertained by the exchange. The passengers around them were pretending not to listen, but Karen knew better. She was being laughed at, humiliated. Her face burned. With no other option, Karen slumped back into her seat, seething. The turbulence rattled the plane again, making Karen grip the armrests. Her only solace was knowing that this nightmare would eventually end. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the chaos around her. Then she felt something wet on her arm. Her eyes snapped open in horror. The teenager's soda had spilled onto her designer coat. Karen screamed. "Oops," the boy muttered, barely fazed. "My bad." Karen's hands trembled with rage. This wasn't just a bad flight. It was hell on earth. And the worst part? She hadn't even faced the biggest humiliation yet. That was still waiting for her just a few rows behind. Karen's hands shook with rage as she frantically blotted at the sticky soda stain on her designer coat. Her first-class seat? Her dignity? Shattered. Now she was crammed in economy, surrounded by noisy, inconsiderate people, suffering through what had to be the worst flight of her life. And Mark, her own husband, was nowhere to be found. Karen twisted in her seat, searching the rows behind her, scanning for Mark's familiar face. He had been suspiciously silent this entire time. Her eyes darted over the passengers, past families with restless children, past college students in sweatpants, past exhausted businessmen. Then she saw him, 2 rows back, seat 36C, sitting calmly, flipping through a magazine, as if this entire disaster wasn't happening. Karen's fury boiled over. She unbuckled her seatbelt, ignoring the turbulence warning, and stormed down the aisle toward him. Passengers glanced up, sensing drama. A few nudged their seatmates, watching as Karen closed in on her husband. Mark barely looked up. "Karen." Karen's voice was dangerously low. "You knew." Mark turned a page in his magazine. "Knew what?" Karen slammed a hand on his armrest. "Don't play dumb, Mark. You knew my ticket was for economy." Mark finally met her furious gaze. "Of course I knew." Karen staggered back. "You what?" He sighed, setting the magazine aside. "Karen, I booked these tickets. Both of them." Karen's mind spun. "But you told me." "I told you we were flying to London," he interrupted smoothly. "I never said you had a first-class seat." Karen stared at him. "So you put me in economy on purpose?" Mark leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "Karen, you're out of control." Karen blinked rapidly, as if she had misheard. "Excuse me?" Mark exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "The way you treat people. The way you act like the world owes you something. It's getting worse." Karen's fury turned ice cold. "You're blaming me?" "I'm saying," Mark said carefully, "that maybe it was time you got a little perspective." Karen's breath caught. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. Her own husband, the man who was supposed to support her, who had given her this life of luxury, was now humiliating her in front of an entire plane. Karen's heart pounded. "Mark, fix this." Mark tilted his head. "Fix what?" "Get me back in first class." Mark sighed, leaning back in his seat. "Karen, first class is full. You're not getting an upgrade." Karen's face burned. "Then get yourself downgraded so we can sit together." Mark's eyes flickered with something Karen didn't recognize. Disappointment. "No," he said simply. Karen reeled back. "No." Mark shook his head. "Karen, I booked these seats separately for a reason." The air thickened between them. Karen's hands trembled. "What do you mean?" Mark hesitated. Then, in a voice cold and final, he said, "I think we need to talk about us." Karen's stomach twisted. "No," she whispered. "Not here." Mark's expression didn't change. "Then when?" Karen's head spun. She couldn't breathe. Passengers were still watching, pretending not to listen. She could feel their judgment pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. Her entire world was unraveling at 30,000 feet. And it was only getting worse. Karen staggered in the cramped aisle, gripping the back of a seat for support. Her own husband, the man she had built the life with, had deliberately put her in economy class. And now, he was sitting there, calm as ever, telling her they needed to talk? Karen's chest tightened. This wasn't just about the flight. This was something bigger. She forced a laugh, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Mark, you're not serious. You're just messing with me." Mark didn't smile. "I'm serious, Karen. Karen's fingers curled into fists. You pick now on a packed flight to bring this up. Mark leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Karen, when was the last time you actually listened to me? When was the last time you considered anyone but yourself? Karen's face flushed. She wanted to argue, to snap back, to tell him he was wrong. But she saw it now, the exhaustion in his eyes. This wasn't just about the seat. Something was breaking between them. Karen's heart pounded. Mark, whatever this is, let's talk about it later. When we land. Mark studied her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. There won't be a later, Karen. Her stomach dropped. What do you mean? Mark exhaled, looking down at his hands, before meeting her eyes again. I want a divorce. The words hit like a slap. Karen froze. Passengers in nearby rows pretended not to hear, but she knew they had. Even the teenager in the seat next to hers was watching, with interest now. Karen's mind raced. Mark, stop. You don't mean that. I do. No, you don't, Karen snapped. You're just angry. You're mad about the flight, about the seating, about whatever this is. But you don't just throw away a marriage over something so stupid. Mark's jaw tightened. Karen, it's not about the flight. It's about who you've become. Karen's heart pounded against her ribs. Mark, don't do this. But Mark's voice was steady. It's already done. Karen stared at him, her world spinning. Then a voice interrupted. She didn't even know? Karen snapped her head around. A flight attendant stood nearby, tablet in hand, eyes widening in realization. Karen's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? She demanded. The flight attendant hesitated. Then, glancing at Mark, she said carefully, Ma'am, your ticket wasn't booked under your name. Karen's skin prickled. What? The attendant checked the screen again. Your ticket was booked by your husband. Karen's breath hitched. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She turned back to Mark, rage rising in her chest. You booked my seat in economy? On purpose. Mark didn't deny it. Karen's hands shook. Why? Why would you do that to me? Mark exhaled, looking her dead in the eyes. Because I wanted you to understand how it feels to be treated like you're less than someone else. Karen's stomach twisted. Mark leaned in, his voice quiet but cutting. For years, I've watched you look down on people. On waiters, cashiers, drivers, hotel staff, flight attendants, anyone you thought was beneath you. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but Mark kept going. I've seen you humiliate people just because you could. You act like the world owes you something. Like you're better than everyone else. Karen's chest tightened. That's not, but today, Mark continued, you were the one treated like an inconvenience. Karen froze. Mark leaned back, his expression unreadable. How did it feel, Karen? She couldn't answer. Her mind spun, searching for a way to twist the situation, to regain control, but for the first time, she had nothing. No excuse. No way out. Because the truth was staring her in the face. And worst of all, it wasn't just a flight. Mark wasn't leaving her because of a bad seat. He was leaving her because she had become someone he couldn't love anymore. Karen's throat tightened. She felt all eyes on her. Passengers whispering, judging, enjoying the downfall of a woman who thought she was untouchable. Karen's vision blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't break. She couldn't. But deep down she knew. She had already lost everything. Karen stared at Mark, her chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. Her own husband, the man who had promised to stand by her, had just humiliated her in front of an entire plane. She wanted to scream, to demand that he take it back. But the look in Mark's eyes told her everything she needed to know. He meant it. And worse, she had nothing to say in her own defense. Passengers were still watching, their gazes flickering between her and Mark, some pretending not to listen, others not even bothering to hide their interest. Karen's entire body burned. She was trapped not just in this miserable seat in economy, but in a moment she couldn't escape from. She took a shaky breath, lowering her voice. Mark, let's just talk about this when we land. Mark didn't even blink. There's nothing to talk about. Karen's stomach twisted. You're really doing this? Mark sighed, rubbing his forehead. Karen, I've been trying to tell you for months. You just never listened. Karen gritted her teeth. Oh, so this is my fault? Mark met her gaze. Yeah, it is. The words hit harder than she expected. Karen shook her head, refusing to accept this. This wasn't how her life was supposed to go. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. A few rows behind, a woman whispered, honestly, she had it coming. Karen's head snapped around. The whisperer, a brunette in her 40s, didn't even look away. She just shrugged, clearly unapologetic. And Karen realized the entire plane was against her now. Her outburst in first class, her attitude, the way she had treated the flight crew, everyone had seen it. And now, they were enjoying her downfall. Karen's hands clenched into fists. She turned back to Mark, desperate for some kind of lifeline. But he was already flipping through his magazine again, as if she didn't matter anymore. Karen's throat tightened. Then, a shadow fell over her seat. Karen looked up, and there she was. Captain Michelle Carter, the pilot. The woman Karen had disrespected without knowing who she was. Karen's stomach knotted. Carter's face was unreadable. In control. Unshaken. She glanced at Mark. Everything okay here? Karen bristled. I don't need your involvement. Carter ignored her. Mark nodded. I'm fine, Captain. Karen's temper flared. Of course you're fine. Carter finally turned to her. Mrs. Smith, I assume you've settled into your seat. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Carter's gaze hardened. I suggest you make the rest of this flight easier for yourself. You're already on thin ice. Karen's heart pounded. She opened her mouth to snap back, but Carter was already walking away. And Karen realized something. She had lost control of this flight. No one was on her side. No one was going to save her from this moment. The plane suddenly shuddered from another small pocket of turbulence. Karen gripped her armrests, glaring at nothing. This was her worst nightmare. A flight she would never forget. And then a voice broke the silence. Deep, steady, undeniably firm. I think we should separate our finances when we land. Karen whipped around to face Mark. She stared at him, unable to process the words. Mark met her eyes with finality. Everything we built together, it ends when this flight does. Karen's world collapsed. She had already lost first class. Now, she was losing her marriage, too. And at 30,000 feet in the air, there was nothing she could do about it. Karen sat rigid in seat 34B, her breath shallow, her pulse pounding in her ears. Mark's words still hung in the air like a death sentence. Everything we built together, it ends when this flight does. Her mind refused to process it. First class? Gone. Her dignity? Destroyed. And now, her marriage, the life she had spent years crafting, was slipping through her fingers. She turned to Mark, her voice a sharp whisper. You're seriously telling me this now? In front of, she gestured wildly, an entire plane? Mark didn't flinch. It wouldn't matter when I said it, Karen. You wouldn't have listened anyway. Karen's nails dug into her palms. Passengers around them were still watching. Some tried to pretend they weren't, but others, especially the teenager beside her, were openly entertained. She was a spectacle now. Karen's throat tightened. No. She wasn't going to break. Not here. Not now. She straightened her posture, forcing a cold smile. Fine. You want a divorce? Do it. But you'll be hearing from my lawyer. Mark let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Of course. Karen's fury spiked. You think this is funny? Mark turned, finally looking her in the eyes. And what Karen saw made her stomach twist. No anger. No guilt. Just exhaustion. No, Karen, he said, his voice quieter now. I think it's sad. Karen swallowed hard, suddenly feeling unsteady. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Mark was supposed to beg her to change. He was supposed to threaten divorce, but never actually go through with it. She was supposed to have the upper hand. Instead, she was trapped in economy class, humiliated, abandoned, and losing everything. And worst of all, she had no one to blame but herself. A few rows ahead, the brunette woman who had whispered earlier turned slightly in her seat. "Well, this is awkward." A soft chuckle rippled through the cabin. Karen's eyes burned. She wasn't just losing Mark. She was losing the room. She turned sharply to the flight attendant walking past. "I want a drink." The woman didn't even pause. "We'll serve beverages after takeoff." Karen's jaw clenched. "We took off an hour ago." The attendant smiled politely. "Then we'll serve beverages when we reach cruising altitude." Karen's hands curled into fists. Everything was spiraling. And the worst part? The people around her were enjoying it. The teenage boy beside her popped his gum loudly, grinning. "Hey lady, you sure you don't want to switch seats? You're kind of bringing the vibe down." Karen's eye twitched. The whispers, the stifled laughs, the looks of pity. It was too much. Karen snapped. She shoved her tray table up, whirled around, and stormed down the aisle toward the cockpit. Passengers murmured, turning in their seats to watch. But Karen didn't care anymore. She needed control. She needed to fix this. She yanked open the navy curtain separating economy from first class. And standing right there, as if expecting her, was Captain Carter. Karen froze. The pilot raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong, Mrs. Smith?" Karen's hands shook. I need a different seat. There has to be something available." Carter crossed her arms. "First class is full." Karen's breath hitched. "A crew seat then? A jump seat? Anything?" Carter studied her for a moment. Then she sighed. "Mrs. Smith, I think it's time you faced reality." Karen blinked rapidly. "What reality?" Carter's voice was calm, steady, but firm. "You're not special." Karen's stomach dropped. "You're not above anyone else on this plane," Carter continued. "You sat in the wrong seat. You were corrected. Now, you're dealing with the consequences." Karen felt the weight of every set of eyes on her, every passenger, every crew member, and the truth hit her like a tidal wave. She wasn't getting out of this. She wasn't escaping the shame, the judgment, the consequences. For the first time in her life, Karen had to accept defeat. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Carter tilted her head. "Unless you'd rather be escorted off the plane?" Karen snapped out of it. "No." Carter nodded toward economy. "Then I suggest you take your seat." Karen stood frozen for a moment. Then, with no other choice, she turned and walked back to her seat in economy. Passengers watched in silence. She could feel the judgment, the pity, the satisfaction radiating off them. And when she finally sat down, sinking into seat 34B, she realized this was it. She had lost everything. Karen sank into seat 34B, her body rigid, her hands gripping the armrests, as if she could somehow hold onto the last fragments of control. But she knew. It was over. She had been kicked out of first class, publicly humiliated, and abandoned by her husband at 30,000 feet. The worst part? Everyone around her knew it too. The teenage boy beside her popped his gum again. So that didn't go well. Karen's eye twitched. She turned her face toward the window, staring out at the endless sky. But even there, she found no escape. Her reflection stared back at her. And for the first time in years, she didn't recognize the woman she saw. Her entire life, Karen had believed in status. She had spent years building an image of power, of wealth, of being someone that people envied. But right now, no one envied her. Not the passengers, not the crew, not even her own husband. And the truth was suffocating. She wasn't above anyone. She wasn't special. She was just another passenger in economy class, struggling to accept the reality that she had created for herself. The brunette woman across the aisle, the one who had been whispering earlier, turned her head slightly. "You good now?" Karen snapped out of her daze. Excuse me? The woman shrugged. Look, I don't know you, but I know your type. Karen's jaw tightened. My type? The woman gave her a pointed look. Yeah, the I'm better than everyone else type. Karen's face burned. The woman sighed. You had this whole meltdown, and for what? Because you had to sit with the rest of us. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the woman shook her head. You want to know what's funny? The woman continued. You were already lucky. Some of us had to save for months just to afford this seat. Karen blinked. I'm a single mom, the woman went on. I work 2 jobs. And you know what? I was excited for this flight. Karen looked away, but the woman wasn't finished. But you? You had a first-class seat, and instead of being grateful, you treated people like trash. And now that you've lost everything, you want us to feel bad for you? Karen's throat tightened. I didn't ask for your opinion. The woman laughed dryly. No, but you sure made us all watch your little tantrum. Karen's fingernails dug into her palms. She wanted to argue. She wanted to win. But what could she say? What could she possibly say? Because the woman was right. A ding echoed through the cabin as the intercom crackled on. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now reached cruising altitude. Flight attendants will be coming around with refreshments shortly. Karen let out a shaky breath. Then, from 2 rows behind her, Mark's voice cut through the silence. Karen. She turned slowly, her heart hammering. Mark's face was calm, unreadable, but his next words sent a cold chill through her. I've already spoken to my lawyer, he said quietly. The papers will be waiting when we land. Karen stared at him, her stomach twisting. Mark, don't do this. Mark's eyes softened just for a second, but then he shook his head. I already have. Karen's breath caught. Passengers around them pretended not to listen, but she knew they were. And for the first time in her life, she felt completely, utterly powerless. Karen turned back in her seat, staring blankly ahead. She had lost her seat. She had lost her status. And now, she had lost her marriage. The flight continued, the world moving forward. But Karen? She had nowhere left to go. Karen sat motionless in seat 34B, her hands resting limply in her lap. The weight of everything pressed down on her like a lead blanket. She was trapped. Not just in this cramped economy seat. Not just on this flight. But in a life she no longer controlled. Her mind replayed the events of the last few hours, like a cruel movie reel, her entitlement in first class, her public humiliation, and now, the final blow. Mark. His words still rang in her ears. The papers will be waiting when we land. Divorce. Her marriage was over. Her status was gone. Her reputation? Destroyed. And the worst part? No one cared. Passengers had gone back to their own lives. The flight attendants continued serving drinks, passing out snacks, chatting with other passengers. No one was looking at her anymore. She wasn't important. Not here. Not anymore. Karen turned toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass. For years, she had built a life of control. She had demanded respect. She had expected everything to go her way, because it always had. Until today. Today, she had lost everything. Her gaze drifted to her own hands, the same hands that had once held shopping bags filled with designer clothes, first-class champagne glasses, and a world of privilege. Now, they were empty. Karen inhaled shakily. For the first time in years, a thought crept into her mind. Maybe this was my fault. The realization was small, but it was there. Had she really been so blind? Had she treated so many people poorly, without even realizing it? Her chest tightened. She had spent so much time looking down on others. Now she was below everyone. And she had put herself there. A soft rustling pulled Karen from her thoughts. She turned and saw the flight attendant she had insulted earlier, the same woman who had calmly endured Karen's entitlement and cruelty in first class. The attendant held out a cup of water. Karen hesitated. It wasn't wine. It wasn't luxury. It was just water. But in that moment it felt like something more. Karen slowly reached out, her fingers brushing the cool cup. She swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. The flight attendant gave her a small, knowing smile. No need, she said softly. Just take it. Karen's throat tightened. She nodded, gripping the cup like an anchor. For the first time since the flight began, she felt human again. Not superior. Not entitled. Just human. The plane descended, and the captain's voice came over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in London shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts. Karen exhaled. This flight was ending, but her real journey was just beginning. She wasn't ready for what came next: the divorce, the fallout, the consequences of everything she had done. But for the first time, she wasn't avoiding it. She wasn't fighting it. She was just accepting it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step forward. As the wheels touched down, Karen closed her eyes. She had fallen from the sky. Now it was time to figure out how to stand again. Karen thought she had it all: status, privilege, control. But at 30,000 feet, she lost everything. Her first-class seat, her reputation, her marriage. And in the end, she was left with only herself. Was this just karma catching up? Or was it a chance for redemption? Let us know what you think in the comments. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. Now tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location below.